page Q1, the endocrine system. Before I start to go through the endocrine system here on page Q1, let's look at page Q4. Q4. So on page Q4, it shows a picture of the endocrine glands. Now, there are really, in fact, many, many endocrine glands. We're just going to describe some of them. Now, the most important of all the endocrine glands is the pituitary gland, commonly known as the master endocrine gland of the body, located in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. The master endocrine gland of the body, really at the base of our brain. We'll have more to say about that. The thyroid gland. The thyroid gland, we know, is right here in our neck on both sides of the thyroid cartilage of the larynx. Notice that they did write the word thymus. They did that just so you understand, don't confuse thyroid with thymus. Thymus is part of the lymphatic or immune system. Another endocrine gland is the pancreas, specifically the pancreatic islets or islets of Langerhans. And then the testes. The testes, of course, are the male reproductive organs that secrete testosterone, a hormone. The ovaries of a woman, the reproductive organs of a woman that secrete estrogen and progesterone hormones. The adrenal glands. Now, we saw the adrenal gland on the cat, right above the kidney. So we'll talk about what the adrenal gland does. And here it points out there's an outer cortex and an inner medulla. And then a gland that probably many of you have never heard of, the parathyroid glands. And the last one, the pineal, I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about the pineal gland. Now, the first one I'd like to address are the thyroid glands. So we've got a picture here. The thyroid gland, there's two parts to it, right and left. They're on both sides of the larynx. And let's look at page Q1. So on page Q1, here I drew, I mean, you don't have to draw it because you got a picture already on Q4, but here's an amazing picture of the thyroid gland. Now, the cells of the thyroid gland actually secrete two hormones. Two. Most of the cells of the thyroid gland produce a hormone that most of us are familiar with called thyroxine. Now, thyroxine increases the biochemical reactions, the metabolic. The word metabolic means biochemical reactions associated with energy production, growth, and development. So thyroxine is needed for normal energy production, and it's needed for normal growth and development in a child. So in fact, if as an adult, if an adult has hypothyroidism, hypo means low amounts, so one of the characteristics of an adult who has hypothyroidism is they're low in energy, they're tired all the time and cold all the time, because thyroxine speeds up the production of energy in the form of ATP. Now, if a child, if an infant has hypothyroidism, then the bigger issue, forget about that they're low in energy and tired, they don't develop normally because thyroxine is needed for normal growth and development. So what they end up doing is they're short in stature, physically short, and mentally retarded. That's called cretinism. And the DEF just means a deficiency. A deficiency of thyroxine in an infant, in a child, results in cretinism, where the individual is both physically shorter than normal, but even more seriously mentally retarded. Now, this is considered so serious that the state of California and most other states in the United States at this time require that every newborn baby born in the hospital must be tested for thyroxine at the time they're born. So some of you are familiar with that. When a baby is born, they draw blood from its heel, usually, and they are required to run a few different tests. And one of the tests they are required by state law to run is a test for thyroxine. If that newborn infant is found to have hypothyroidism, they immediately put them on a regimen of Synthroid, synthetic thyroxine, so that they will grow and develop normally. And that prevents mental retardation. So, and it works, totally. So the state of California believes, and I agree with them, it would be tragic to not test for this and have a child end up being mentally retarded when it was totally preventable if you had simply run that test at the time they were born. So California is one of the first states to require that. Now almost all the states do.
Will the child need to take the medicine forever?
Yes, because they don't have a thyroid. They obviously have hypothyroidism, so their thyroid isn't making it. But the most critical time, I mean, it's one thing as an adult if we are low in thyroxine and low in energy. It's a whole other thing if we don't develop normally. So thyroxine is needed for both energy production and growth and development. Now, there are a small number of cells in the thyroid gland that produce a hormone you probably have never heard of called calcitonin or thyrocalcitonin. And it's called that because it affects calcium levels in the blood. It actually lowers the calcium levels in the blood. I'm not going to test you on what it does to phosphate levels, but I am going to ask that you know that it lowers calcium levels in the blood. I'm going to explain it better in just a moment. Now, surrounding the thyroid gland are 4 parathyroid glands. The parathyroid glands are called para because they are around, para means around the thyroid. Each of the parathyroid glands is about the size of a pea. Now, they're not really green, even though I made them green, but they are about the size of a pea, and you have 4 of them. And they produce a hormone, the parathyroid glands produce a hormone called parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone has exactly the opposite effect that calcitonin does. Calcitonin lowers the calcium levels in our bloodstream, and parathyroid hormone raises the calcium levels in our bloodstream. So these are the yin and yang, as it were, the opposite effects on the calcium levels. Again, I won't test you on what they do to phosphate levels. Now, to help us understand parathyroid hormone and calcitonin better, I wrote see page D13. Now, section D is one of the favorite sections that we keep referring to, going back to more than any other section. That's histology. So way back on page D13, at the bottom of the page, it looked like this. We were learning on D13 about bone tissue. We know that bone cells are called osteocytes. But at the very bottom of D13, we said we actually have osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Anybody remember this? And it's the osteoblasts that actually secrete calcium mineral in our bone tissue. What the osteoblasts do is the osteoblasts take calcium from our bloodstream and secrete it in our bones. So the osteoblasts, and now we're pointing out here, is that what activates the osteoblasts to do this is the hormone calcitonin. Calcitonin produced by certain cells in the thyroid gland activates the osteoblasts to transfer calcium from the bloodstream into our bones. So if the osteoblasts are transferring calcium from our bloodstream into our bones, they are lowering the amount of calcium in our bloodstream, but increasing the amount of calcium mineral in our bones. That's called ossification. So calcitonin is important for strong bones. It causes some of the calcium in our bloodstream. You'd say, well, where does the calcium in our bloodstream come from? When you have a glass of milk. right? So you have some milk or you have any other food that's a good source of calcium. You absorb that into your bloodstream. And we don't need all this calcium in our bloodstream. We need the right amount. So let's store that extra calcium in our bones. That keeps our bones strong. That improves bone density. And that's called ossification. But we had learned that there was this other type of bone cell called osteoclasts. Osteoclasts are activated by that other hormone, parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone activates the osteoclast to break down the bone tissue, to dissolve that calcium mineral in the bone and transfer the calcium from our bones to our bloodstream. So what it does is it breaks down the calcium to release that calcium into our bloodstream. You'd say, like, why do you want to do that? Because we need a certain amount of calcium in our bloodstream. Calcium is needed for muscle contraction, and it's needed for many other functions. But we've certainly learned that it's needed for muscle contraction. So if we don't have enough calcium in our bloodstream, that's not good either. So these are the two hormones that regulate how much calcium is in our blood and how much calcium is in our bones. As long as everything's working okay, as long as the yin and yang are in balance, we're in balance. But if we've got too much of one or not enough of the other, then the balance is off, and we either don't have enough calcium in our bloodstream or not enough calcium in our bones or whatever it is. So this is how a lot of things in our body work. One of the major themes in physiology is this kind of yin and yang balance between many different aspects of the body. You know, an example of yin and yang that we've talked about in this class is how we have skeletal muscles that are flexors and extensors. And we need to have the right balance of flexion and extension. So anyhow, that's the balance. So way back on D13, you probably saw this a long time ago, wondered what that was, and now we've come back to it. So back where we were on page Q1, so on Q1, these two hormones, calcitonin and parathyroid hormone, regulate our calcium levels in our blood. I'm not going to test you on hypocalcemia and decalcification. I'm not. So we won't test you on that. Let's mention the adrenal gland. Now, the adrenal gland consists of an inner and an outer part. The inner part of the adrenal gland is called the adrenal medulla. The outer part of the adrenal gland is called the adrenal cortex. Have we ever heard these terms before? Yes, for the kidney. Most recently, the kidney. We had learned about an outer renal cortex and an inner renal medulla. And we had said that our brain has an outer cerebral cortex and an inner medulla in our brain. So these terms, cortex and medulla, are commonly used to refer to outer and inner part of an organ. Now, let's start with the adrenal medulla. What is it? They are really neurons. The inner part of our adrenal gland are really neurons. And these neurons in the adrenal medulla, like all neurons, release chemicals called neurotransmitters. Neurons release chemicals called neurotransmitters. Now, the name of the neurotransmitter that these neurons release is called epinephrine or adrenaline. That's the name of a neurotransmitter. But what's interesting about this neurotransmitter is that these neurons release this neurotransmitter into the bloodstream. So this neurotransmitter called epinephrine or adrenaline is released into the bloodstream. Now when do these neurons release this epinephrine or adrenaline into the bloodstream? They commonly will release it during situations like exercise or stress. So during exercise or stress, they release this epinephrine or adrenaline. So if you're getting ready to compete, and you're going to be running a race, you're going to be competing in a basketball game, or you may even be competing on an exam. So the expression is the adrenaline starts to flow. And that adrenaline or epinephrine speeds up your metabolic rate. It speeds up makes your heart beat faster. It raises your blood pressure. It makes you jittery. Now, unfortunately, none of that is all that useful when you're going in to take an exam, but it is useful if you're going to run a race. It speeds up your heart rate and raises your blood pressure, it increases your breathing, and it's gearing up your body to compete. If you're in a combat zone, the adrenaline starts to flow and it energizes your body. Right? People say, you know, that when they're stressed or in a crisis, they were able to do things they couldn't normally do because of the adrenaline, increasing that energy production in their body. So it's interesting that in terms of these two names for the neurotransmitter, epinephrine and adrenaline, the words literally mean the same thing. Epinephros is Greek for on the top of the kidney, because it's produced by this adrenal gland, which is on top of the kidney. So epinephros, epi, like epidermis, means top, and nephros means kidney. A nephron is the structure in a kidney. And adrenaline means the exact same thing in Latin. Ad, in Latin, means above or on top, and renal is Latin for kidney. So literally, adrenal means above the kidney, and epinephros means above the kidney, because this is a neurotransmitter produced by these neurons in this gland above the kidney. All right, so we wrote that it increases metabolic rate, heart rate, breathing, blood flow to the muscles during exercise. Now, the adrenal cortex, the outer part of the adrenal gland, secretes a number of steroid hormones. In a biology course, you learn that steroid hormones are hormones made from cholesterol. It's not so much that I'm going to test you on that. You're going to hear a lot more about that in physiology. These are called steroid hormones. Now, there are really many steroid hormones produced by the adrenal cortex. These are epithelial cells that secrete many steroid hormones into the bloodstream. I'm just going to mention two classes of steroid hormones secreted by the adrenal cortex into the bloodstream: the mineralocorticoids and the glucocorticoids. Now, I'm not going to ask you specific names. Aldosterone is a specific name of a mineralocorticoid. Cortisol is the name of a specific name of a glucocorticoid. We'll just call them mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids. The mineralocorticoid steroid hormones are called mineralo because they affect mineral balance. They affect salt and potassium levels. These are mineral levels. What the mineralocorticoids do is they cause our kidneys to retain salt and water. Cause our kidneys to retain salt and water. And so rather than excreting salt and water, we retain it. Now, they also affect potassium levels. I'm not going to emphasize that. You will certainly learn all about this in tremendous detail in physiology. But we're just trying to give you a bit of an introduction to this. The glucocorticoids are called gluco because one of the things they affect is your glucose or sugar levels in your bloodstream. The glucocorticoids raise our blood sugar levels. They do a number of other things as well, but that's a subject for physiology. So they raise our blood sugar level. I am not going to test you on these terms, Addison's disease or Cushing's disease. I'm not. You will hear all about them in physiology. So these are steroid hormones secreted by the adrenal cortex. Let's just do one more before we take a break. On Q2, so just before we take a break, the pancreas. Now, we've just been tested on this. We know our pancreas is a unique organ. It's the only organ in our body that is both an exocrine gland and an endocrine gland. The endocrine part of the pancreas is called the pancreatic islets, or islets of Langerhans. We know that the beta cells secrete the hormone insulin into our bloodstream. The alpha cells secrete the hormone glucagon into the bloodstream. You know, we just reminded you that parathyroid hormone and calcitonin are the yin and yang in controlling our calcium levels. Insulin and glucagon are the yin and yang in controlling our blood sugar levels. So insulin lowers the sugar levels in our blood by promoting glycogenesis. And we needed to know that for our third exam. That's a big subject in physiology. That's the taking of sugar out of the bloodstream and storing those sugars as glycogen, largely in our liver. That's called glycogenesis. Glucagon, just the opposite. It promotes glycogenolysis, lysis, the breaking apart of glycogen into glucose and the release of that glucose into the bloodstream. So it raises the sugar levels in the blood. So very similar to how parathyroid hormone and calcitonin affect cells and affect the calcium levels, similarly these hormones are affecting cells and affecting the amount of sugar, how much sugar is in our bloodstream and how much sugar is stored as glycogen, especially in our liver cells. We know that a deficiency of insulin is called diabetes mellitus. DEF, deficiency, not enough. So if somebody has diabetes, what's wrong with their blood sugar level? Is it too low or too high? It's too high. Because insulin is what lowers it. So if they don't have the insulin, they can't lower it. They can still raise it, they can't lower it. And people always say, well, you know, what's wrong with that? But we know over and over and over again, we've said the body works best when it's the right amount. Anything less than normal or more than normal is not normal. Your body temperature shouldn't be higher than normal and shouldn't be lower than normal. It should be in the normal range. The testes, of course, produce the male sex hormone testosterone. We're going to have more to say about that when we get to the reproductive system. The ovaries produce two hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen is the feminizing hormone. That's the counterpart to what testosterone is in a guy. There is no counterpart to progesterone in a guy. Progesterone, and we mentioned this a long time ago back in section C when we were dealing with embryology, progest literally means to prepare for pregnancy, gestation, prepare for gestation. So this is the hormone that prepares a woman's body every month for possible pregnancy. One of the things that this hormone does is it promotes the growth of blood vessels in the endometrial lining of the uterus. And obviously if a woman gets pregnant, those blood vessels will nourish the embryo. You'd say, well, what if she doesn't get pregnant? Then she sheds those blood vessels out the vaginal or birth canal, and that's called having a period. So a woman has a period when she didn't get pregnant. That's the shedding of the vessels. Now, we'll have more to say about those hormones when we get to the reproductive system. The placenta will remind you, really, the chorionic sac of the placenta, the fetal portion of the placenta, produces a hormone called chorionic gonadotropin. We first talked about it back on C11. And that's the hormone that also stimulates the production of progesterone by the ovaries and maintains the vascularization of the endometrial lining for the duration of the pregnancy. And it's also what they test for to see if a woman is pregnant. It wouldn't do any good to test if she's got estrogen or progesterone in her body, because women produce estrogen and progesterone in their body every month, whether or not they get pregnant. But the only time a woman would have this hormone in her body is if there's a chorionic sac surrounding a baby, because that's where that hormone comes from. So that's the hormone they test for in a pregnancy test. And that takes us to page G3. Now, before we look at the pituitary gland on G3, let's look on G4. I'm sorry, Q4. Thank you. Q4. Thank you. On page Q4, right in the middle of Q4. So on page Q4, what are we looking at? We're looking at the pituitary gland. If you're saying, well, that's the pituitary, here's how it was drawn up here on the top right. All right, so here's the same thing. Now, the pituitary gland is actually attached to the hypothalamus of your brain. It's actually attached to the hypothalamus of your brain. The pituitary gland is also known as the hypophysis. And in case you're wondering, like, do we have to know that?
Yes.
Yes. The hypophysis. And the pituitary gland, or hypophysis, is made up of two halves. Two parts to it, two halves. This part here is called the neurohypophysis. There's the word, hypophysis. It's called the neurohypophysis because it is really a continuation of the hypothalamus of the brain. So it's called neuro. It's really part of the nervous system. It's also known as the posterior lobe of the pituitary because it's on the back side. The front lobe, the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, is known as the adenohypophysis. The adenohypophysis. Anybody know what adeno means? Did we ever learn adeno? Yeah, we did learn it. Page A4. No? Adeno means gland. And on the top of A4, you wrote adenoma at the very top of the page, a tumor of a gland. It's called adenohypophysis because it is a true endocrine gland made up of epithelial cells. So this is a little bit like the adrenal gland that we spoke of earlier, where the inner part was really part of the nervous system, made up of neurons, and the outer part was a true gland. This part is really part of the nervous system, and this is a true gland. Now I want to speak first about the neurohypophysis, or posterior lobe. This is really made up of neurons. And these neurons release neurotransmitters into the bloodstream. This reminds us exactly of the adrenal medulla, which was made up of neurons that released a neurotransmitter called epinephrine into the bloodstream. So that wasn't unique because it happens also right here. On the previous page, Q3, so let's talk about this. On Q3, so the neurohypophysis actually secretes two neurotransmitters, two different neurotransmitters into the bloodstream. One of them is called antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. And the other is called oxytocin. These are really neurotransmitters released by neurons of the neurohypophysis. Now, antidiuretic hormone, what does that mean? Some of you have heard the word diuretic. A diuretic is a drug that makes you pee, makes you urinate. What's the name of this neurotransmitter hormone? Antidiuretic. It stops you from peeing. It makes you retain water so that you only excrete small volumes of urine. Now at this moment, some of you might be thinking, wait a second. Didn't you all teach us earlier about a hormone that did the same thing? Well, earlier on the bottom of Q1, I mentioned mineralocorticoids released by the adrenal cortex. They cause your kidneys to retain salt as well as water. So you'd say, yeah, that's the same thing. No, it's not. The mineralocorticoids make your kidneys retain salt and water. Antidiuretic hormone makes your kidneys only retain water. That's a difference. The importance and significance of that will be made more obvious when you get to physiology. It's a big difference. Now, oxytocin is a neurotransmitter hormone that you probably have heard before. It's actually made available under a brand name called Pitocin. It stimulates labor contractions. That's what causes a woman to go into labor. And in fact, if a woman is late in going into labor, they can induce labor by giving an injection of Pitocin. And within 5 minutes, she's in labor. So it makes the uterus contract. Now, it also causes milk letdown. I'm not going to test you on milk letdown, but it also does that. Okay, so those are the two neurotransmitter hormones released from the neurohypophysis. Let's go back to Q4 as we learn more about the adenohypophysis. So on Q4, the adenohypophysis secretes 6 hormones. 6 hormones. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's see, we got to count it right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 hormones. 6 hormones released by the adenohypophysis. Now, of these 6 hormones released by the adenohypophysis into the bloodstream, and it is a true gland, 4 of the 6 are called tropic hormones. And you might say, they're called what? Tropic hormones. A tropic hormone, I wrote at the bottom, is a hormone that affects another endocrine gland. That's what tropic means. It affects another endocrine gland. So let me first identify the 4 tropic hormones released by the adenohypophysis that affect other endocrine glands. So the first one I'll mention is this one right here called thyrotropic hormone. And what does thyrotropic hormone released from the adenohypophysis do? It affects the thyroid gland. Tropic means to affect. A-F-F-E-C-T, to affect. What does it affect? Thyrotropic. It affects the thyroid. It stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete thyroxine. So no wonder the pituitary gland is known as the master endocrine gland. Not only does it release so many hormones, it releases hormones that control other endocrine glands and the release of their hormones. So it is the master endocrine gland. Another tropic hormone is adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone affects the adrenal cortex, and it causes the adrenal cortex to secrete the glucocorticoids. The glucocorticoids. We'll see all of this is written on Q3. Now there are 2 more tropic hormones. They are called gonadotropic hormones. They affect the gonads. What are gonads? Reproductive organs. So they affect the reproductive organs, and there are 2 of these gonadotropic hormones, luteinizing hormone, or LH, and follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH. They control the ovaries of a woman and the testes of a guy. All right, let's summarize those 4 first. Back on Q3. So on Q3, we're talking about the 4 tropic hormones released by the adenohypophysis. The first is thyrotropic. It's also known as TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, and it stimulates. Okay, I misspelled it. Stimulates. It activates the thyroid gland to secrete thyroxine. The second, adrenocorticotropin. Adrenocorticotropin stimulates the adrenal cortex to secrete the glucocorticoids. And then there are 2 gonadotropic hormones. Follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, and luteinizing hormone, also known as LH. They stimulate our gonads, our reproductive organs, to produce gametes, sex cells, and sex hormones. Now those are the 4 tropic hormones. But let's go back to Q4. Back on Q4, there are 2 hormones released from the adenohypophysis that do not affect other endocrine glands. They are not tropic hormones. They are growth hormone and prolactin. Growth hormone does not affect another endocrine gland. Growth hormone affects the growth of our body. It's not affecting another gland. It causes the growth of our bones and our muscles. And prolactin stimulates the mammary glands to produce milk. Are the mammary glands endocrine glands? No. What kind of glands are they? Exocrine glands. Very good. Exocrine glands. The mammary glands don't produce hormones. They secrete milk out through ducts. They come out the breast, come out the nipple. That's an exocrine gland. So growth hormone and prolactin, and lacto means milk. The sugar that's in milk is lactose. If a woman is lactating, she's producing milk. The hormone that stimulates milk production is called prolactin. So let's summarize these 2 hormones on Q3 at the bottom. Growth hormone stimulates growth in the body, especially the skeletal system. If you have a deficiency of growth hormone, that leads to the person being short. That's called dwarfism. If somebody has an excess, if a child has an excess of growth hormone, that causes gigantism. If an adult has an excess of growth hormone, that causes acromegaly. Anybody remember that? Because once you're an adult, you can't grow taller, but the bones can grow thicker. We'll refer you back to some pages in just a moment. Prolactin stimulates the mammary glands to produce milk. The mammary glands are exocrine glands. Now, I referred you to pages here, D18 and E7 and E8. And let's just remind you of those real quickly. If we go back to page D18, section D is the section we refer to more frequently than any other. That's histology. And on D18, this is when we were learning about how bones develop. And we learned that the long bones of our body, the bones of our legs and arms, develop by endochondral bone formation. And we learned that there is this growth plate of hyaline cartilage called the epiphyseal plate. And right up here, we said there were two hormones that stimulate the growth of this hyaline cartilage at the growth plate and therefore cause our bones to grow longer. One of them is growth hormone, and the other was testosterone, and that's what we're talking about right now is growth hormone. On page E7, so you'll recall that on the bottom of E7, we had said that a deficiency of growth hormone during childhood would result in dwarfism, and an excess of growth hormone during childhood would result in gigantism, but an excess of growth hormone in an adult would create this condition of acromegaly. And in fact, on the next page, on the bottom of E8, you'll remember this series of pictures, of photos, of a woman who develops acromegaly. So there's a coarsening in her features, an enlargement of her mandible and her hands and so on. That was called acromegaly.